Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking Member States for the engagement with my mandate. I'm very grateful for the support I receive from you as well as civil society. In this opening statement, I would like to introduce my thematic report on journalists in exile, as well as reports of my visits to Honduras and Serbia last year. 2 years ago, in my report on media freedom in the digital age, I drew the attention of the Council to the dangerous decline in media freedom and safety of journalists in almost every region of the world. This report focuses on one of the consequences of that decline, on journalists who have been forced to flee their countries because of threats to their life, liberty, and rights, including the right to freedom of opinion and expression. The upward trend of journalists in exile and attacks on them track the rise of authoritarianism and suppression of media freedom in various parts of the world. Unfortunately, exile does not always provide safety to journalists and is often marked with multiple challenges. Let me highlight 4 key concerns. First, many journalists are in grave danger because of the alarming rise in transnational repression from their home governments, including assassinations, assaults, abduction, enforced disappearance, prosecution in absentia on trumped-up charges, and retaliation against family members. The aim is to obstruct, intimidate, and silence journalists and their sources, and create an environment of fear in which self-censorship prevails to the detriment of freedom of expression. The safety of journalists is doubly jeopardized when the host country colludes with the home state, for example, in cross-border abductions. Second, digital transnational repression has surged in recent years, including online violence, smear campaigns, targeted digital surveillance, hacking, and blocking of exiled news sites. Because journalists in exile are highly dependent on social media and digital tools to gather news, they're particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks and digital threats. As it is often not possible to identify and prosecute who is behind such attacks, impunity prevails, emboldening the perpetrators. Third, the threats to which women journalists in exile are exposed, especially those living without their families or who have no legal status in the country of refuge. Online and offline sexual and gender-based violence, rape threats, doxing, harassment, and orchestrated smear campaigns with highly sexualized and misogynistic elements have skyrocketed in recent years. Fourth, the precarious legal status of many journalists in their country of refuge. Only a handful of states offer humanitarian visas on an urgent basis, work permits, or resettlement opportunities to journalists. Demand far outstrips the supply. Often journalists flee to neighboring countries and live without formal legal status, which makes them vulnerable to arrest and deportation or abduction and attacks from across the border. The lack of proper legal status also affects their ability to continue to work as journalists. Eventually, the legal limbo and lack of support takes a heavy toll, and many journalists abandon their profession. Journalists in exile deserve most support. They fulfill a vital social need by providing public interest news to audiences at home and abroad. They are often an important independent source of information on countries where media freedom is severely restricted. Let me now turn to some conclusions and recommendations. First, international human rights and refugee law provide a strong legal framework. The problem is the states' failure to respect their international obligations. Targeting journalists on foreign soil violates human rights principles as well as the obligation to respect the principle of territorial sovereignty. This Council has condemned extraterritorial targeting of journalists in recent resolutions, but so far without much effect. I urge the Council to give more focused attention to this issue. Whether it is labeled as extraterritorial targeting or transnational repression, It is a blatant violation of international law. Neither impunity nor collusion should be tolerated. Second, political considerations often color the response of receiving countries. Journalists should not be treated as political pawns. They are human beings who, at great cost to themselves, serve a critical social purpose of fulfilling the right to information. I urge states to take a rights-based, human approach to journalists in exile. States are obliged under international law to ensure that no one is deported, expelled, or extradited to a territory where their life or freedom could be threatened. I call on states to respect that cardinal principle. Journalists at risk need emergency visas and residence and work permits and well-coordinated long-term support to sustain public interest media outlets. I urge states to expand the visa schemes and encourage funders and civil society to provide sustained support to journalists in exile. Third, I call on companies to ensure that the technologies that are essential to practice journalism are not disrupted or weaponized against journalists in exile. Finally, many journalists in exile are likely to qualify as refugees, but with specific needs given the threats they face and the work they do. Cooperation and collaboration among UNHCR, OHCHR, and UNESCO should be strengthened. Let me now turn to Honduras, which I visited in October last year. I had substantive and high-ranking meetings with all branches of government, relevant state institutions, and extensive meetings with civil society. I would like to thank the government for the invitation and for its cooperation and support during my stay. Honduras faces complex, long-standing human rights problems deeply rooted in poverty, inequality, corruption, organized crime, and weak institutions, and aggravated by high levels of violence and marginalization of indigenous and peasant communities. In the interest of time, I will skip the findings and only highlight some key recommendations. First, it is imperative that the government proactively builds an open and trustful relationship with civil society and indigenous communities. Human rights defenders, journalists, and social communicators deserve recognition and support. Public officials should refrain from stigmatizing and attacking them in ways that could endanger them or undermine their credibility. Second, end impunity for killings and enforced disappearances of human rights defenders, journalists, social communicators, and give it high political priority. Third, the national protection system should be overhauled through a multi-stakeholder process involving civil society, the state entities, and OHCHR. And fourth, Honduras should ratify the Escazú Agreement. I am pleased to see an openness and willingness on the part of the government to seek technical assistance from international and regional organizations, including the OHCHR, and I encourage the government to push forward with human rights reforms in collaboration with national and international stakeholders. Finally, I turn to Serbia and Kosovo, which I visited in April 2023. I am grateful to government officials, state institutions, and civil society for the time they gave me and to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Serbia and UNMIK and other authorities in Kosovo for their support and assistance to the mission. I acknowledge the strong constitutional and legal framework on freedom of expression in Serbia and welcome the government's plan to carry out further legal reforms in line with international and European standards. However, the adoption of laws alone is not sufficient to protect freedom of opinion and expression or to ensure the safety of journalists and human rights defenders. The inadequate implementation of laws and policies, the failure of the government to tackle hateful, divisive speech and smear campaigns by powerful actors, the targeting, denigration, and endangerment of journalists, human rights defenders, activists, and political opponents, and the inability of the regulatory authority of electronic media to carry out its responsibilities in an independent, effective, and competent manner raise serious concerns about the state of freedom of expression in Serbia. I have made various recommendations, but here I would like to underscore that the most important factor will be strong, unequivocal political commitment and leadership on the part of the government to uphold its own laws and policies. With regard to Kosovo, I'm encouraged by a legal framework largely in line with international standards and an overall environment conducive to the right to freedom of expression. Although recent political tensions along ethnic lines have highlighted the polarized environment in which journalists and human rights defenders operate. While acknowledging the emergence of a vibrant media landscape in Kosovo, I note that it is fragile and faces some challenges. In July last year, following a criminal report to the police, the authorities suspended the license of Clan Kosovo, one of the largest media outlets in Kosovo, in what has been alleged by civil society actors as a political act to silence it. There are also concerns about the law on the Independent Media Commission. I call upon the Assembly to safeguard the independence of the Commission so that it can retain the trust of all sections of society. An independent, diverse, and pluralist media sector is essential to ensure accountability of public institutions and build trust in society in the post-conflict context in Kosovo. Thank you.